Washington, D.C. It all starts on New Year's Day, 1997. 17-year-old Kareem McCraney and his friend, 16-year-old Mamoru Stewart, went to confront this guy in their Washington, D.C. neighborhood. Now, they say this guy had repeatedly beaten and robbed them. But these two kids show up to 22-year-old Mark Rosebeer's apartment, and the kids have handguns. So an argument breaks out. And these two teenagers say that they saw Rosebeer reaching for his waistband as if he had a gun, which caused them to open fire, killing Rosebeer. Rosebeer, of course, ended up being unarmed. So at the teens' trials, prosecutors argued that McCraney and Stewart had gone to this apartment intending to rob and kill Rosebeer. Both children were convicted as adults of first-degree murder, and both were sentenced as children to life in prison. So the next 20 years of this story are pretty grim. McCraney and Stewart both spent the next 20 plus years in prison. But Mr. McCraney earned his GED and an associate's degree in paralegal studies and ultimately became something of a resident legal expert while in prison. And Mr. Stewart also earned his GED, and he completed something like 1,400 hours of college-level coursework on subjects like political science, anger management, and African studies. Prison officials really leaned on Mr. Stewart, asking him to mentor many of the younger people he was incarcerated with. So you've got the situation in which over the course of 2 decades, both of these young men convicted as children became real leaders, accomplished individuals. So that brings us to 2018. 2018, after 21 years in prison, Mr. McCraney successfully petitioned for his release from prison, becoming the very first beneficiary of a Washington, D.C. law, which is designed to give second chances to people who were convicted of serious crimes as children. Mr. Stewart followed suit a year later, and I am very happy to report, because we all need something nice to think about these days, that both of these young men are thriving in their lives on the outside. We have a picture of them now back home, living better lives, living lives, in fact, as we're going to hear, of enormous achievement, where they've both served as leaders in their community. I hate the term giving back, but boy, are these two people giving back. All right. Mr. McCraney and Mr. Stewart are not alone. They are among 55 people who've had their sentences reduced to time served under this law, which went into effect in 2017. Now, here's something really amazing. When we talk about recidivism, right, we're talking about like people who get out and then are rearrested later for new crimes or reconvicted of new crimes. When people talk about recidivism, sometimes they mean different things. But the point is, a lot of recidivism rates you hear about are high, 60%, 50%, something like that. Of the people released under this law, the recidivism rate is 0. Not one of these individuals have gone on to commit new crimes since their release. And beyond that, it's not just about not doing bad things, it's about doing good things. Many of these people who've been released have found new jobs working as youth violence prevention counselors in DC. So they are affirmatively making DC a demonstrably better place. So now, thinking about this, lawmakers in Washington, D.C., led by Ward 6 Council member Charles Allen, are on the verge of expanding eligibility for this law. So currently, in order to apply for release under this law, you have to have been younger than 18 at the time of the crime, and you must have spent at least 15 years behind bars. Think about how old you were 15 years ago, just to frame that amount of time. But on Tuesday, the City Council is set to vote on something that is called the Second Look Amendment Act, which would extend the program to people who are as old as 24 at the time of the crime. And applicants would also have to show, of course, evidence of rehabilitation, demonstrate a record of good conduct while in prison, prove they're not a threat to society. So we're really talking about a group of people who are accomplished, who've really worked hard to turn over a new leaf, as it were. Now, advocates for this law say that this amendment would make some 300 incarcerated people eligible to petition for release. And this Second Look Amendment Act has attracted pretty broad support from DC's mayor, the Attorney General, and other high-profile local officials. Now, this is just the latest in a string of sentencing reform measures across the nation that are informed by developments in scientific research. Why is this important? We talk about this a lot. Criminal justice is kind of a weird field. If somebody wants to talk to you about taking a COVID vaccine, you probably want to know about what scientists have checked it, medical testing that's been done. In other words, what's the evidence for its safety? It's because when we talk about medicine, we tend to think about evidence. But when we talk about criminal justice, all too often we don't talk about what the evidence shows. We talk about how people feel. What's scary? What makes you mad? What do you recoil from? These emotion-based responses really don't get us good criminal justice policy. What gets us good criminal justice policy is like looking at the evidence of what works to actually make people safer and doing those things. So looking at the science here, we know research has shown that the brains of teenagers and young adults are not fully developed until the age of 25. In fact, the thing that's not developed, the thing that you need in order to be a mature brain, that prefrontal cortex, which regulates decision-making, planning, good judgment, expression of emotions, impulse control, like all of these factors that go into transgression and misconduct, and yes, criminal behavior. That's the part of the brain that is the last to develop that kids don't have when they're younger than 25. So all of this research on brain development has finally begun to seep into the law. It's long overdue, but it started to factor heavily into Supreme Court decisions, which ruled it unconstitutional to sentence people who are under the age of 18 to death or mandatory life without parole. It has also been a catalyst for reform in California, Illinois, elsewhere. And I would also add that this science of brain development tells us a lot about the importance of sentencing reform, because not only do young people have crappy impulse control, but they also have a phenomenal capacity for change and rehabilitation. And also, like on the flip side of this coin, older people being released when they are older, pose very little public safety risk because they essentially age out of criminal behavior. If you are looking at science, there is very little reason to ever keep older people locked in cages. I can't believe I just had to say that phrase, but here we are in the American legal system. However, who's against all this evidence-based change? Well, prosecutors, police, and their tough on crime allies are aggressively opposing the Second Look Amendment, despite the fact that Washington, D.C.'s incarceration rate is already higher than any state's. They are still fighting to keep more people in cages, people who science tells us could safely be released. So we'll start with DC's Trump-appointed US Attorney, Jesse Liu, who has misleadingly claimed that this amendment would harm public safety and be offensive to victims. There's also David Gorman, the chief of the homicide section in the US Attorney's Office, who told the Washington Post that the amendment would send a message of lenience by telling the community that 15 years is the appropriate sentence for murder. But Gorman's argument really ignores some very important details. First of all, this amendment has no impact on sentencing. If you commit a murder in DC today, you can get a life sentence. The amendment would not change that. It simply gives people who are already in prison and who have already done a lot of time to request that their sentences be reviewed by a judge. It doesn't even get them out of prison. It just gets them what it says, a second look, a chance to be evaluated, to have a chance to prove how much they've done, how much they've accomplished and worked on themselves and changed. So there's no guarantee that these petitions will even be accepted. Gorman is essentially arguing against ever looking again at people who have had their lives ostensibly thrown away. Now, second of all, there's an interesting factor playing into this decision. Research has shown what deters people from committing crimes. Some people credit this. Let's take a look. Very few people committing crimes thinking, well, I'm going to commit this crime, I'll get caught, and then I'll do this number of years. No. What deters people is not the severity of a sentence. Life sentences are not a great deterrent. Death sentences, also not a great deterrent. In fact, it's the certainty of punishment rather than its length that can actually serve as a deterrent. In other words, no one really believes that there's a would-be murderer out there in DC thinking about committing a murder and deciding to go ahead and do it because in 15 years they will be able to petition to have their sentence reviewed. No, that's ridiculous. As for U.S. Attorney Liu's claims that the Second Look Act would harm victims and their families, the reality, of course, is much more complex. If you want to know what's offensive to survivors of crime, you should probably actually ask survivors of crime, as opposed to listening to people who purport to speak for them. So some survivors may wish to keep someone incarcerated, but a lot of others feel very differently. There was an opinion article published by the Washington Post this year, in which April Goggins, who's an organizer with Black Lives Matter DC, took issue with what she called the fear-mongering and weaponizing of some survivors' experiences. Goggins wrote that, and I'll quote here, "As a Black woman and mother who has survived sexual assault and intra-community violence, I will not tolerate being spoken for." And when she talked about whether she supported the Second Look Act, she said, without any reservations. And she said that was because, quote, "keeping people in jail does not make us safer." When Kareem McCraney's petition for early release went before a judge in 2018, the niece of Mark Rosebuer, the man McCraney and Stewart had killed, showed up to the hearing. Why did she show up? To oppose the motion? No. She actually showed up to say that she didn't oppose his motion for resentencing. And I'll quote what she said at that hearing as well. She said, "I was hurt, but I was brought up to forgive, and not forgiving him won't bring my uncle back. I hope he has learned from his mistakes, and I hope he works with our youth now that he's out to make sure they don't make the same mistakes." Really impressive. So by all accounts, Mr. McCraney has done exactly that. He's now an employee for the city of DC, and he works to improve services provided to young people who've been caught up in the criminal legal system. If the city approves the Second Look Amendment Act tomorrow, more people like Mr. McCraney will have a chance to prove that they are more than the worst thing they've ever done. And if we truly want to rein in mass incarceration in the United States and stop being like the prison capital of the world, more states and jurisdictions are going to have to follow DC's lead and bring about their own sentencing reform efforts. After all, the majority of people in prison are there because of states and local jurisdictions, not because of the federal government. And it's not enough to focus on people who are, the usual, just the nonviolent drug offenders, folks. It's not enough to just limit the conversation to people who are in prison on nonviolent drug offenses. Half of the prison population nationwide is incarcerated on an offense that is classified as violent. Some of those we might interpret as violent, some of them are only technically violent, but either way, you can't cut all these people out of the conversation and expect to get to a result that changes the nature of incarceration in America. Many of these people, even people who may have done something violent many, many, many years ago, people like Mr. McCraney, people like Mr. Stewart, many of them are facing the prospect of decades, if not life in prison, for one terrible choice they made when they were very, very young. Over the years, I don't think it will shock any of you to remember that people grow and change. You grew and changed. I grew and changed. We all grow and change. None of us are the same person that we were at 16 years old. So if that's true of all of us, if that's just like a fact about humans, shouldn't humans be given a chance to demonstrate that growth and request that a judge look at how much they've done to change and look at the value of their life and the value of their efforts and of their work? I mean, shouldn't they have the right to ask a judge to judge them based on who they are today instead of who they were 15 years ago? To me, that does not seem like we're asking for very much. It seems, in fact, very reasonable. And hopefully, many politicians are starting to agree. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. This has been The Appeal Live. You can follow us on Twitter or Facebook, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.